John Anderson was the kind of man who found joy in life's simplest pleasures. He wasn't one for big parties, flashy cars, or expensive vacations. Instead, he cherished quiet moments, moments like the ones he spent every Saturday morning by Willow Lake. It wasn't just any lake. It had been part of his family for generations. His grandfather had fished there when the area was nothing but open fields and tall trees swaying gently in the breeze. John's father taught him how to cast a line when he was barely old enough to hold a fishing rod. Those memories were etched deeply into his heart. When the neighborhood around Willow Lake began developing into an upscale gated community, things changed drastically. The once open land transformed into manicured lawns, sleek houses with shiny rooftops and neatly paved roads. The HOA, Homeowners Association, took over management of the lake, turning it into a centerpiece for the community. But even after selling the property years ago, John still felt connected to the water. To him, it wasn't just a lake. It was home, history, and heritage wrapped into one shimmering expanse of blue. Every Saturday, without fail, John would wake up before dawn. He'd brew himself a strong cup of coffee, pack his favorite thermos, grab his trusty fishing rod, and head out to the dock. There was something magical about being near the lake at sunrise. The world felt calm, almost suspended in time. Birds chirped softly as the sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The gentle lapping of the water against the shore created a soothing rhythm that seemed to whisper secrets only John could understand. On this particular Saturday, everything started off as usual. John parked his car at the edge of the community park, not far from the lake. He strolled down the familiar path, breathing in the crisp morning air. The dew clung to the grass, sparkling like tiny diamonds under the early light. As he reached the dock, he smiled to himself. This place never failed to bring him peace. He set up his gear carefully, selecting the perfect bait for whatever fish might be lurking beneath the surface. Then, with practiced ease, he cast his line into the water and settled onto the wooden planks, waiting patiently for a bite. While all was quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the soft splash of his lure hitting the water. But then, something unusual happened. Out of the corner of his eye, John noticed movement on the pathway, leading to the dock. At first he thought it might be another resident out for an early walk, or perhaps someone else looking to enjoy the tranquility of the lake. But as the figures drew closer, he realized they weren't ordinary visitors. They were police officers. 2 uniformed officers approached him cautiously, their boots making faint crunching noises on the gravel path. One of them, a younger man with sharp features, stepped forward while the other hung back slightly, keeping watch. "Sir," the officer said in a firm tone, breaking the silence, "we need to speak with you." John turned slowly, surprised, but not alarmed. He squinted against the rising sunlight to get a better look at the officers. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. The officer hesitated for a moment, glancing at his partner before continuing. "We've received complaints about you fishing here without permission. Do you have a permit to fish in this lake?" John blinked, taken aback. A permit? He hadn't needed one when the lake belonged to his family, and even after selling it, he'd always assumed he still had the right to fish there. After all, the lake held so much meaning for him. I didn't know I needed a permit," he replied honestly. "This lake used to belong to my family. I've been coming here for years." The officer frowned, clearly unmoved by John's explanation. "Regardless of past ownership, sir, the lake is now managed by the HOA. Only residents with valid permits are allowed to fish here. We're going to have to ask you to come with us." John felt a mix paranoid. How could this be happening? He had done nothing wrong, or so he believed. Fishing in the lake was second nature to him, like breathing. Yet here he was, being confronted by 2 officers because someone had decided to make a fuss. Still he cooperated, knowing it was best not to argue. As they led him away from the dock, leaving his fishing rod behind, John couldn't help but wonder who had reported him and why. Little did he know, this seemingly minor incident would soon spiral into something much bigger than he could have imagined. Back in the neighborhood, whispers were already spreading about the troublemaker who dared to defy the HOA's rules. And unbeknownst to John, his connection to the lake and to the local police department would become the center of attention in ways no one expected. As he sat in the back seat of the patrol car, watching the familiar streets roll by, John tried to stay calm. He reminded himself that misunderstandings could be resolved. What he didn't realize yet was that this situation would reveal long-buried truths, challenge old grudges, and ultimately force both him and his neighbors to reconsider what really mattered in their shared community. The HOA board had been keeping a close eye on John Anderson for quite some time. To them, he was an enigma, a man who didn't quite fit into the polished, rule-bound world they had worked so hard to create. The Willow Lake community prided itself on order and exclusivity. Residents paid hefty fees to maintain the pristine landscaping, secure gated entries, and exclusive amenities like the lake itself. For many, it was a status symbol, a place where life unfolded in perfect harmony, free from disruptions or chaos. But John, he was different. He wasn't flashy or showy, nor did he attend the HOA's social gatherings or participate in their committees. Instead, he kept to himself, living quietly in his modest home at the edge of the development. And then there was his habit of fishing in the lake every Saturday morning, a practice that increasingly grated on the nerves of the HOA members. They saw him as someone who refused to conform, someone who flouted their carefully crafted rules without a second thought. Mrs. Peterson, in particular, had taken a strong dislike to John. She was the kind of woman who thrived on control, meticulous, outspoken, and unyielding. As the head of the HOA's compliance committee, she made it her mission to ensure every resident adhered strictly to the association's guidelines. Her yard was always immaculate, her mailbox perfectly aligned with the curb, and her curtains drawn at precisely the right hour each evening. To Mrs. Peterson, John's casual presence on the dock was not just a nuisance, it was an affront to everything the community stood for. Over the past few months, she had noticed him more frequently. Whether it was early mornings when she walked her dog or late afternoons when she sat on her porch sipping tea, John was always there, casting his line, leaning back against the railing, looking utterly content. It infuriated her. Why doesn't he apply for a permit like everyone else? She muttered to herself one day, glaring at his silhouette from across the water. Doesn't he understand how things work around here? Her frustration reached its peak earlier that week when she spotted him fishing yet again. This time, she decided enough was enough. After consulting the HOA's bylaws, she discovered that only residents with explicit permits could fish in Willow Lake. Armed with this knowledge, Mrs. Peterson marched straight to her phone and dialed the local police department. Her voice trembled with indignation as she reported the matter. "There's a man trespassing on our property," she declared. "He's fishing in the lake without permission, and he's doing it repeatedly. You need to do something about it." The officers who responded to her call were professional but skeptical. Complaints about fishing violations weren't exactly common, and they wondered if this was truly worth their time. Still, protocol demanded they investigate. When they arrived at the lake and saw John sitting peacefully on the dock, they couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. He looked harmless, just an older man enjoying a quiet morning outdoors. But duty called, and they approached him cautiously, asking for identification and explaining the situation. John, for his part, listened patiently but grew increasingly irritated as the conversation unfolded. "I've been coming here for years," he insisted, his tone firm but measured. "This lake used to belong to my family. I have rights here." The officers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. They weren't lawyers after all, and parsing through decades-old property agreements wasn't part of their job description. All they knew was that someone had filed a complaint, and they needed to act accordingly. By the time they escorted John to the patrol car, word of the incident had already begun to spread through the neighborhood. Some residents watched curiously from their windows as the officers led him away, while others whispered among themselves, speculating about what might have happened. A few even felt a twinge of guilt. John had always seemed like a nice enough guy, quiet, unassuming, and generally harmless. Was it really necessary to involve the police over something as trivial as fishing? Meanwhile, back at the station, the officers processed John's information and prepared to issue a citation. What none of them realized, at least not yet, was that John's story went far deeper than anyone could have guessed. Unbeknownst to the HOA, the legal documents governing Willow Lake contained a clause granting John partial ownership rights as part of the original sale agreement. It was a detail buried deep within pages of legalese, overlooked by nearly everyone except John, and perhaps a handful of sharp-eyed attorneys. As John sat in the station, waiting for the next steps, his mind drifted to his son, Michael. Michael had followed a very different path in life. While John preferred solitude and simplicity, Michael thrived in leadership roles. He had joined the police force straight out of college, rising quickly through the ranks until he became the chief of police in their small town. John rarely involved Michael in his personal affairs, preferring to handle things on his own. But, now faced with this unexpected turn of events, he couldn't help but wonder how his son might react. Sure enough, it didn't take long for Michael to hear about the situation. Dispatch informed him almost immediately upon processing John's details. At first, Michael assumed it was some sort of mix-up, a clerical error or miscommunication. But when he walked into the room and saw his father sitting there, slightly disheveled but otherwise unharmed, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Dad?" Michael asked, shaking his head. "What are you doing here?" John shrugged, trying to play it cool despite the absurdity of the situation. "Fishing, apparently illegally," he replied dryly. "Your fine deputies seem to think I'm breaking the law." Michael chuckled under his breath, though his amusement was tinged with concern. Sitting down beside his father, he asked for the full story. As John explained what had happened, Michael's demeanor changed. By the time John finished recounting the events, Michael's jaw was set in determination. He knew his dad well enough to understand that this wasn't just about fishing. It was about principle, history, and respect. Without wasting another moment, Michael began reviewing the case file. When he came across the mention of Willow Lake, his eyes narrowed. "Wait a minute," he said, turning to his team. "Do any of you know about the ownership clause tied to this lake?" The officers stared blankly, clearly unfamiliar with the intricacies of local property law. Michael nodded knowingly. "That's what I thought. My dad technically co-owns part of that lake. Someone needs to remind the HOA, and whoever called this in, that they're barking up the wrong tree." As the reality of the situation sank in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The officers exchanged awkward glances, realizing they had unwittingly stepped into a much larger and more complicated issue than they had anticipated. Meanwhile, John leaned back in his chair, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time since the confrontation at the lake, he felt a glimmer of hope. If nothing else, this whole ordeal had proven one thing. Sometimes, even the simplest moments, like casting a line into still waters, could lead to revelations no one saw coming. When Chief Michael Anderson walked into the police station and saw his father sitting there, slightly disheveled but otherwise unbothered, he couldn't decide whether to laugh or sigh in frustration. John sat calmly on a hard plastic chair, his fishing hat still perched on his head, looking like he'd just come back from a leisurely stroll rather than being detained for supposed trespassing. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much to process. "Dad?" Michael began again, leaning against the desk as he tried to maintain his composure. "What exactly happened out there?" John shrugged, as if this kind of thing happened all the time. "I was doing what I always do, fishing at the lake. Next thing I know, 2 officers show up and tell me I'm breaking the law. Apparently I need some kind of permit now." Michael raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't think to mention that your family used to own the lake? Or that you technically still have partial ownership rights?" John gave him a sheepish look. "Well, I figured they wouldn't believe me anyway. Plus, I thought maybe people around here would have remembered by now." Michael shook his head, torn between amusement and exasperation. His dad had a way of underestimating how little others knew or cared about history. To most residents of Willow Lake, the community was shiny and new, built on land they assumed had no strings attached. They had no idea about the decades of stories tied to the water or the legal agreements hidden deep within dusty files. Deciding it was time to take charge, Michael turned to his team. "All right, let's clear this up. Someone get me the file on Willow Lake's ownership records." As the officers scrambled to pull the necessary documents, Michael pulled up a chair next to his father. "You realize this is going to cause a bit of a stir, right?" John chuckled softly. "Stir? Son, I think it might turn into a full-blown hurricane." Within hours, the news spread like wildfire through the small town. Word got out that John Anderson, the quiet man who fished every Saturday morning, wasn't just any resident. He was part owner of Willow Lake. And not only that, but his son happened to be the chief of police. The combination of these facts sent shockwaves through the community, leaving everyone scrambling to make sense of the situation. At first, disbelief reigned supreme. Some residents dismissed the claims outright, convinced there must be some mistake. Others were intrigued, digging through old records and gossiping about how something so significant could have gone unnoticed for so long. But the biggest reaction came from the HOA board, particularly Mrs. Peterson, whose complaint had sparked the entire ordeal. Mrs. Peterson felt blindsided. She had expected a quick resolution, a slap on the wrist for John, followed by strict enforcement of the rules moving forward. Instead, she found herself facing a tidal wave of complications. When she learned about John's partial ownership, her face turned pale. For someone who prided herself on control, this revelation was nothing short of catastrophic. The HOA called an emergency meeting later that afternoon, inviting key members, including John and Michael, to discuss the matter further. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone filed in. Residents whispered among themselves, casting curious glances at John, who entered with Michael by his side. If anyone doubted the seriousness of the situation before, seeing the town's police chief walk in alongside the accused left no room for ambiguity. Mrs. Peterson wasted no time taking center stage. Standing at the front of the room, she addressed the crowd with her usual authority. "This is unacceptable," she declared, her voice sharp and unwavering. "We cannot allow individuals to exploit loopholes in our system. Mr. Anderson may claim ownership, but we have rules for a reason. Allowing exceptions sets a dangerous precedent." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from some corners of the room, but others remained silent, clearly unsure where they stood. One elderly resident raised his hand hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mrs. Peterson, but isn't it true that Mr. Anderson's family owned the lake before the HOA took over? Shouldn't we respect that connection?" Mrs. Peterson bristled at the question. "Respect doesn't negate responsibility," she snapped. "If we start making exceptions for one person, where does it end?" It was Michael's turn to speak. Rising from his seat, he addressed the group with a calm yet commanding presence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your concerns, but let's focus on the facts. My father's partial ownership of Willow Lake is legally binding. It's not a loophole or an exception. This isn't about bending rules, it's about recognizing rights that were established long before many of us moved here." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "That said, I also recognize the importance of maintaining order within the community. Perhaps instead of viewing this as a conflict, we can find a solution that works for everyone. Maybe it's time to revisit the lake's usage policies to ensure they're fair and inclusive while respecting existing agreements." The room fell silent as Michael finished speaking. His tone was measured, his points logical, and his position undeniable. Even Mrs. Peterson seemed momentarily speechless, though her expression betrayed her simmering frustration. After a lengthy discussion, the HOA reluctantly agreed to amend their policies to acknowledge John's rights. However, they insisted on drafting new guidelines to prevent similar situations in the future. While the outcome provided some resolution, the underlying tension remained. Old grudges don't disappear overnight, especially when pride and principles are at stake. As the meeting wrapped up, John lingered behind, watching as residents filed out of the room. Some avoided eye contact, embarrassed by the drama that had unfolded. Others offered polite nods, unsure how to reconcile their previous assumptions with the reality of the situation. Michael stayed by his side, offering quiet support as they prepared to leave. On the drive home, John stared out the window, lost in thought. "You know," he said finally, breaking the silence, "this whole mess has made me realize something. People aren't just upset about me fishing. They're threatened by the idea that someone might have more rights than they do. It's not really about the lake at all." Michael nodded, understanding exactly what his father meant. "Change is hard for some folks, Dad, especially when it challenges their sense of control." John sighed, resting his chin on his hand. "Still, I wish there was a way to fix things without all this hostility. I never wanted to cause trouble. I just wanted to fish." Michael glanced at him, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Maybe there's a way to turn this around. Something that brings everyone together instead of driving them apart." For now, though, John decided to focus on the positives. He had survived the ordeal with his dignity intact, and his son had proven, once again, why he was such a valuable ally. But deep down he knew this wasn't the end of the story. The real challenge lay ahead, finding a way to mend fences and rebuild trust in a community that had grown increasingly divided. As they pulled into the driveway, John stepped out of the car and looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. The colors reflected off the surface of Willow Lake, reminding him of all the memories he cherished. No matter what happened next, one thing was certain. The lake would always be a part of him, just as he was a part of it. The days following the HOA meeting were tense and awkward for everyone involved. While the board had reluctantly agreed to amend their policies to accommodate John's partial ownership rights, the underlying tension in the community remained palpable. Whispers echoed through neighborhood streets and sidelong glances replaced friendly waves. For John Anderson, it was a strange and isolating experience. He had always been a quiet man who preferred solitude, but this newfound animosity felt heavier than he expected. At first, John considered retreating further into himself, to avoid stirring up more trouble or giving his neighbors another reason to resent him. But something inside him resisted that urge. Over the years, he had come to appreciate the simplicity of life in Willow Lake, even if the community wasn't perfect. The lake itself still held its magic. The way the sunlight danced across the water, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the peacefulness that came with casting a line into the unknown. It pained him to think that his presence there, which had once brought him so much joy, now caused division among people who shared the same space. One evening, as John sat on his porch sipping coffee, an idea began to form in his mind. What if, instead of pulling away, he leaned in? What if he used this moment, not to assert dominance or prove a point, but to bridge the gap between himself and his neighbors? After all, the lake wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone in some capacity. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to remind them of that shared connection. The next morning, John called a local event planner he knew from years past, a cheerful woman named Linda, who specialized in organizing community gatherings. When she answered the phone, her voice bubbled with enthusiasm. "John, long time no hear. What can I do for you?" "Linda," John said, clearing his throat slightly, "I need your help planning something special, something big." Her curiosity was immediately piqued. "Big? You mean like a block party or—" "No, bigger than that," John interrupted gently. "I'm thinking of hosting a day at the lake, an event where everyone in the neighborhood is invited. We'll call it Fishing for Unity. Free lessons, food trucks, live music, prizes for the biggest catches, you name it." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Linda burst out laughing. "John, are you serious? You want to throw a festival after everything that's happened?" "I've never been more serious," John replied firmly. "Look, I know things have been complicated lately, but sometimes the best way to fix a problem is to bring people together. If we can share a laugh or two, or even catch a fish, together, maybe we can start healing some of these wounds." Linda hesitated for only a moment before her excitement returned. All right, John, you've got yourself a deal. Let's make this happen. Word of the event spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards, social media posts popped up on resident groups, and announcements were made during the HOA's weekly updates. At first, skepticism reigned supreme. Many residents wondered if John's intentions were genuine, or if this was simply another attempt to assert his influence over the community. Others dismissed the idea entirely, assuming it would fizzle out before gaining traction. But then something unexpected happened. People started signing up. For some, it was curiosity about the man behind the controversy. For others, it was the promise of free food and entertainment. And for a few, it was the chance to reconnect with the natural beauty of Willow Lake, which had somehow gotten lost amidst the drama of recent weeks. Whatever the reason, by the time the day of the event arrived, nearly half the neighborhood had RSVP'd. On the morning of Fishing for Unity, the atmosphere around the lake was electric. Tents lined the shore, offering everything from bait and tackle rentals to hot dogs and lemonade. Local musicians set up near the picnic area, strumming guitars and playing folksy tunes that drifted lazily through the air. Children ran barefoot along the grass, giggling as they chased each other, while adults mingled awkwardly but politely, exchanging small talk about the weather or the latest sports scores. John stood at the center of it all, wearing his signature fishing hat and a warm smile. Beside him was Michael, who had taken the day off work to support his father. Together they welcomed guests as they arrived, shaking hands and thanking them for coming. Even Mrs. Peterson showed up, though reluctantly, and hovered near the edge of the crowd, clutching her purse tightly as though ready to flee at any moment. As the hours passed, something remarkable began to unfold. Slowly but surely, barriers started to break down. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months found themselves chatting amicably over plates of fried chicken. Kids teamed up to cast lines into the water, cheering wildly whenever someone reeled in a fish. One elderly man, whose wife had passed away earlier that year, opened up to a younger couple about how much he missed having company. Tears welled in his eyes as they promised to visit him soon. Even Mrs. Peterson softened, albeit subtly. She watched from afar as John patiently taught a group of beginners how to bait their hooks and cast their lines. His calm demeanor and genuine kindness struck a chord with her, forcing her to confront the possibility that perhaps she had misjudged him. Later, when he approached her with a plate of food, she accepted it hesitantly but managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she murmured, almost too quietly for him to hear. By the end of the day, the mood had shifted entirely. Laughter filled the air, and the tension that had plagued the community for weeks seemed to dissolve, if only temporarily. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, John climbed onto a small stage to address the crowd. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This lake has meant so much to me and my family over the years. But seeing all of you here today reminds me that it doesn't belong to just one person. It belongs to all of us. So let's keep taking care of it. Together." Applause erupted, echoing across the water as people cheered and clapped. Some even whistled, clearly moved by John's words. For the first time in what felt like forever, the community felt united, not divided. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes began to take root. Residents who had once avoided John now greeted him with smiles and nods. The HOA board loosened its grip slightly, allowing for more flexibility in how the lake was used. And though old habits die hard, the seeds of understanding and cooperation had been planted. For John, the event marked a turning point, not just for the community, but for himself as well. He realized that standing his ground didn't have to mean creating enemies. Sometimes extending a hand was far more powerful. As he sat on the dock the following Saturday morning, watching the sunrise ripple across the water, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Willow Lake was more than just a body of water. It was a reminder of where he came from and where he hoped to go. And for the first time in a long time, he believed the future might be brighter than he dared to imagine. In the weeks following fishing for Unity, a quiet transformation began to ripple through Willow Lake. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a neighbor waving warmly instead of pretending not to notice John as he passed by, or a brief chat at the mailbox that turned into an actual conversation. But over time, these small gestures added up, creating a sense of warmth and connection that hadn't existed before. John noticed the change most acutely during his Saturday morning fishing trips, where once he had felt like an outsider on the dock, now he often found himself joined by others. Some were seasoned anglers eager to swap tips and stories, while others were newcomers who wanted to learn the basics. It became something of a tradition. People would bring their chairs, snacks, and tackle boxes and spend hours talking about everything from fishing techniques to family recipes. The lake, which had been a point of contention, was slowly becoming a place where relationships blossomed. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had initially resisted attending the event, started showing up occasionally. She never stayed long, but her presence spoke volumes. One crisp autumn morning, she approached John cautiously as he sat casting his line into the water. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she said, her tone polite but measured. "Mind if I join you?" John glanced up, surprised but pleased. Of course not, have a seat." For a few moments they sat in silence, watching the ripples spread across the surface of the lake. Then Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat softly. I wanted to apologize," she admitted, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I may have acted hastily when I called the police. I thought I was protecting our community, but looking back, I realize I let my frustration get the better of me." John nodded thoughtfully, choosing his words carefully. "It's okay, Mrs. Peterson. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we move forward. And honestly, I think this whole situation has taught us all something valuable." She looked at him, her expression softening. "You're right. Maybe it's time we focus less on rules and more on what brings us together." From that day on, Mrs. Peterson became one of the most vocal supporters of keeping the lake accessible to everyone, not just those with permits. Her shift in perspective inspired others to reconsider their own attitudes, leading to broader discussions within the HOA about fostering inclusivity rather than exclusivity. Meanwhile, Michael watched these changes unfold with pride. As chief of police, he saw firsthand how strained relationships could escalate into conflict, and how acts of kindness and understanding could diffuse tensions before they spiraled out of control. Watching his father navigate such a challenging situation with grace and humility reinforced his belief in the power of diplomacy. He even incorporated some of John's lessons into his work, encouraging officers to approach disputes with empathy and patience. One evening, as father and son sat side by side on the porch sipping coffee, Michael broke the comfortable silence. "You know, Dad, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" John asked, raising an eyebrow. "You always talk about how the lake is part of your legacy. But after everything that's happened, I think your real legacy isn't the lake. It's the way you've brought people together. That's something money can't buy." John chuckled softly, though there was a hint of emotion in his eyes. "Well, I suppose you're right. If I leave behind anything worth remembering, I hope it's the idea that we're stronger when we stand together than when we try to keep each other out." As winter approached, the community continued to grow closer. Holiday decorations began appearing on porches and lampposts, and plans were made for a neighborhood potluck to celebrate the season. For the first time, John received multiple invitations, not just to attend but to contribute. He decided to bake his grandmother's famous apple pie recipe, knowing it would be a hit. On the night of the potluck, laughter filled the air as residents gathered in the community center. Tables groaned under the weight of homemade dishes, casseroles, roasted meats, fresh-baked breads, and decadent desserts. John's pie disappeared within minutes, prompting several neighbors to beg him for the IOR recipe. As he handed it over, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. A simple dessert had somehow become a symbol of unity, much like the lake itself. Later that evening, as the festivities wound down, someone suggested playing a game of charades. To everyone's surprise, John agreed to participate. His light-hearted, Antics drew roars of laughter, breaking down any remaining walls between him and his neighbors. By the end of the night, he was surrounded by a group of people eager to hear more about his life, his family, and his memories of Willow Lake. Spring arrived sooner than expected, bringing with it new opportunities for growth. Inspired by the success of Fishing for Unity, the HOA proposed turning it into an annual event. This time, however, they invited John to serve as co-chair alongside Mrs. Peterson. Though hesitant at first, John agreed, recognizing the importance of collaboration. Together, they worked tirelessly to ensure the second installment was even bigger and better than the first. When the day finally came, the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. Hundreds of residents flocked to the lake, eager to reconnect with nature and each other. Children raced around with nets trying to catch tadpoles in shallow pools, while adults competed in friendly fishing tournaments. Local businesses set up booths offering crafts, food, and games, further strengthening the bond between the community and its surroundings. As John stood on the stage once again, addressing the crowd, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "This lake has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember, but seeing all of you come together like this reminds me that its true value lies not in ownership, but in connection. Let's continue to cherish it, together." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing across the water like a promise. For John, it was confirmation that the hard work of healing and rebuilding had paid off. The scars of the past hadn't vanished entirely, but they no longer defined the community. Instead, they served as reminders of how far everyone had come, and how much farther they could go if they kept working together. Years later, when John looked back on that tumultuous chapter of his life, he realized it had been a blessing in disguise. The challenges he faced had forced him to confront not only the HOA and his neighbors, but also himself. In doing so, he discovered strengths he hadn't known he possessed: patience, resilience, and an unwavering belief in the power of kindness. Willow Lake remained a constant presence throughout it all, its waters reflecting the changing seasons and the evolving dynamics of the community. But more importantly, it stood as a testament to the idea that even the deepest divides could be bridged with effort, understanding, and a willingness to meet halfway. And so, every Saturday morning, John returned to the dock, not as an outsider or a figure of controversy, but as a beloved member of a thriving community. The sunrises still painted the sky in brilliant colors, and the fish still nibbled at his line. But now, when he cast his gaze across the water, he saw something even more beautiful, a reflection of unity, resilience, and hope.